Okay.
So in the last few classes, I've been having a question in the back of my mind, which is, how in the TNO did we get to unity? So, I mean, that's not a simple question, I understand. So I started thinking about that, and of course just going back in this text, and I know we had discussions about it in the Leahy Monday, but I didn't have time to go back to there. By the way, I haven't been using the forum to ask these questions because I just haven't done them online.
Well, for whatever consolation is, you're not the only one who has been using the forum. So.
What?
You're not the only one who hasn't been using the forum.
No,
Yeah.
I know.
I would encourage. Oh, by the way, since you mentioned that, just let me interrupt you briefly.
Yeah.
That little discussion that I deferred, explaining how the 2 and the 3 are interchangeable materially. I put a rather succinct answer to that on the forum, so you might, if for no other reason, check in on that. I'm sorry. Go on.
Well, and one thing I think about my asking questions is I have sort of some kind of idea that I shouldn't ask a question unless I've tried to answer it myself
Okay.
for a very long time. So sometimes I have time to do that.
Sounds like a good rule. Sounds like a very good rule.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you already wrote the book.
Okay.
After all. So that's one reason that I'm reluctant to answer questions and ask questions. And the other thing is, so I went back in terms of the question of unity and ended up back in the Marx chapter, which was happening while my father was dying, so I feel like I really didn't get it. And so I go back in your teachings a lot, your writing, and realize I need 6 months to think about the Marx chapter. So what am I doing sitting in this class? On chapter 365. So that's part of the issue, I think, maybe for other people around using the forum and asking questions, is the stuff is so absolutely radical and challenging
And
that I feel like a lot of digestive time is needed. So that's just like an explanation of what's happening here. And yet, so I ended up, I thought I was going to get all the way through. I went back to the 250, the Altheiser chapter, and reread that and did a lot of stuff. But I feel like I haven't solved it about what is the logic of how we get to unity in terms of the TNO and the history of the perception of being, which is,
okay, all right.
But
Did
I
you?
don't know whether there's a 5-minute version of that, but I feel like I've got something about going back, and of course, in my experience, I know a lot about it. But in terms of the logic, I feel like I'm not clear. So that's not a question I necessarily expect you to answer.
Well, I'll take a brief stay about it in a moment, but I don't want to cut you off your thought. Did you, since you gave it a lot of thought, did you have a preliminary answer of your own?
Well, yeah. My preliminary answer has to do with the rising of self-consciousness.
Okay.
The fact that everything actually becomes more and more transparent. Therefore, what is perceived as separating boundaries between things turns out to be not that. So the fact that thought can go all the way kind of horizontally and vertically into perception and experience makes it such that unity is possible. So, I mean, that's one of the ways to think about it.
All right.
Is that the actual history of thought means that more and more and more becomes conscious. But then, I mean, this is kind of a radical thing.
Right.
Doing here. So you get all the way in the first reference after the introduction in the Marx chapter has to do with the essential dialectic of the necessity of self as unity, and then you go into unicity. And right there, you say now for the first time, there's nothing but the actuality of light itself existing, everything else is perceived in the light. We talk about the unity of capitalism there. So that's one of the things I got rereading, going back really to that chapter, was something about the, awakening of things from the inside being unbounded, you could say. So in terms of
As you say, you can't give a quick answer, but that never stopped me before trying to do that. So, first of all, my first inclination in response to your question was, to say, well, in a certain sense, it's not, you put it like, how did we get to the unity? And my first inclination was to say, well, it might be more like, it's not like the thinking now occurring has gotten to the unity in an unqualified sense, because in some sense the unity is somewhat of a given. So the real question historically is, what is the nature of the unity, and to what degree is there unity? So I think back, for example, to Novitas Mundi, when we start off with Aristotle, and I right away bring in Hegel's complaint about Aristotle, that Aristotle never got beyond particularity from Hegel's point of view. He didn't have a single unifying principle. So in that context, I would say that your association of the notion of unity with subjectivity, certainly in the modern context, is correct, right? In other words, certainly when Descartes goes into his soul, so to speak, disembodied soul in the Meditations, he in effect, right, de facto, he is establishing a unified center for science, and that's what is that center is the self. So, and that's one of the things that that's fundamentally what the critique of modernity is in the context of the thinking now occurring, is that the unity is what unity there is a self-centeredness. All right. So I think subjectivity is a part of it. But then I was thinking, the intermediate bridge between what I also have on the side of my mind here, I'm thinking of good old Plotinus and the one. So Plotinus has a one which you couldn't immediately associate with modern self-consciousness. Right? He's got a one beyond, an ineffable one beyond all form and beyond all mind in the classical Aristotelian sense, right? So the nous in Plotinus is a secondary God, and the one is beyond that and fundamentally ineffable. So there are different. So what I'm getting at is, so the unity has been around in one form or another for quite some time. The question then becomes, what is the nature of that unity? And so then the other bridge I want to reintroduce here, which we were doing, it must have been in the context of Novitas Mundi again, especially, where when we make the transition to Descartes. Oh, and I know, and I probably hit on this when we did our class on Novitas Mundi, in the light of the thinking I've been doing more recently, and especially what's in Faith and Philosophy, where I do Descartes again from another angle, just as I do Aristotle from another angle. And in Faith and Philosophy, I bring out what is, now we have a clock, what is there to be emphasized, but is not perhaps emphasized so much in Novitas Mundi itself. But what with the notion of the God who creates ex nihilo, Thomas Aquinas introduces into Western thought the notion of totality, in effect, right? In other words, the fact that God creates God, unlike the demiurge of the Timaeus, I thought this place was closed, unlike the demiurge of the Timaeus, who merely informs a pre-existent receptacle, what becomes effectively a matter, to say, in Aristotelian terms. The God, the omnipotent God who creates the world ex nihilo, creates not only the form of the world, but also the matter or the potentiality of the world, so that so therefore you now have a very powerful and rather ontologically specific sense in which the creator God creates in what in metaphysical terms we would understand to be literally, metaphysically speaking, ontologically speaking, the totality of the world, right? Not just shaping an eternally pre-existent matter, you say, but God creates the world as totality. Therefore, the creature takes on the quality of being, whether creature, whether you say creation as a you pardon me, as a totality. Right? The whole of creation now becomes a totality, right? In a way which goes beyond even the classical notion of wholeness, right? In other words, we say the Greeks, Plato has an idea of wholeness, but wholeness and totality are not simply the same thing. And just in English, I think the difference between wholeness and totality is as soon as I say, I mean, if I want to talk about the whole universe, I can do that. And then I can talk about the totality of the universe. I think it's inherent in the notion of totality is what's lurking there is measurement, is addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication as relevant, you say, intrinsically relevant to the very being of the world, right? You see what I'm saying? So it's not an accident in that deeper sense that what modernity does. I mean, the Greeks invented Western mathematics. I mean, they did a damn good job of it. Pythagoras and his guys, they were very sophisticated. And so there's a very sophisticated mathematical tradition that goes right back to ancient Greece and comes down through Western history up until the time of Galileo. And then there's the philosophical tradition, which, because of Aristotle in particular and his influence, was never quite married to that. They were kind of separate, parallel tracks, so to speak, until somebody like Galileo comes along and discovers that he can talk about physics in a way that Aristotle didn't talk about physics. He can talk about physics and see it as intelligible in terms of the kinds of ratios that the Pythagoreans would have fundamentally been interested in, right? So the coincidence of the study of the universe and the mathematical form of that study, that comes to be especially with somebody like Galileo in a kind of classical way. And that's an originality. But what I'm trying to get at is that Galileo was made, just as Descartes was made possible, by something that's going on in the medieval mind already. And I think I told you in a totally different context, what's really fascinating about Thomas Aquinas is that when he talks about the Eucharist, which you think is a very mystical thing, right? Well, all right, that's fine. It's a miracle and God does it and you have to believe in it and so forth and so on. But Thomas is a scientist, 13th century version of a scientist, so he wants to know, how can he understand the appearances, the bread and wine that are no longer understood to be substantially bread and wine, but nevertheless there they are, right? And as I think I pointed out to you, unlike Aristotle, who has a list of 10 categories in one book and then maybe 15 in another book, and that's what bothers Kant, a little bit untidy. But in any event, not only are there two different lists of categories in Aristotle, but there's no particular order to the categories, do you see? And so when Thomas tries to explain the world of physical appearance, he selects an order, and the fundamental category of the physical world for Thomas is dimensive quantity, what Descartes will call extension, do you see? And so right there, he understands that the fundamental building block of the world of appearance is quantity, is quantitative, right? So now, okay, so a little complicated answer to the broad question, but so now when we get into the modern world, there are a couple of issues. One is that the center of this totality, in other words, Descartes in the Meditations defines himself as a meditator, as a creature. He defines himself as totus, as a total being, right? We can understand. Again, I interrupted my thought. So in other words, it's not only the universe is a totality, not simply a whole, it's a totality, but each creature in the universe, each participant in the totality is created. This is also Thomistic, and I don't know whether you get it at first pass. Each creature is totally created. In other words, go back to that Greek idea of wholeness as katholikos, right? That it's not only the big picture, not only the universal in English or in Latin, but also the particular, the perpetualis, the seeking through to each particular. So the wholeness is having what otherwise would be abstracted as the universal in such a way that there's no loss of the detail. Okay, now that's the only one who had that quality of mind in the Greek consciousness would have been the divine mind, let's say in the case of Xenophanes, not in the case of Aristotle, because Aristotle's God was thinking only about itself, right? But Xenophanes, the pre-Socratic philosophical theologian, I guess we might call him, had the notion that the divine mind was a whole in this positive sense, that it had that ability to think of the whole of things without having to sacrifice the details, without having to sacrifice the particular. So now take the wholeness, lay on it or transform it, that kathalikos nature of the wholeness, now make the wholeness a totality without sacrificing the kathalikos part. So in other words, what I'm getting at is that not only does the God of Thomas create the totality of the universe, actuality and potentiality, form and matter, but because of the kathalikos idea is not lost with this new sense of totality, each individual member, so to speak, of the big totality is itself created by God as a total being. All right, and that's the significance of that raising of esse, E-double-S-E, the to be in Thomas, above essence, where we said that Thomas's act of being, which is participation in the divine being via the creative will of God, that is the actuality that potentiates essence. In other words, in Aristotle, we said that if you have essence, existence comes together with it. I mean, there's no essence, you see, that doesn't contain within itself inherently existence, right? For Aristotle, right? But Thomas has created a world of essences that themselves do not exist, because if they exist in the Aristotelian sense, there would be no creation. They'd just be eternal. You see, they just be. They always was and always will be, right? Actually, they're beyond time, as Chuck would hasten to point out, right? That the eternity there is a timeless state of being, all right? But once the world is created totally, in the metaphysical sense, right? Matter and form, potentiality and actuality, then Thomas has to supply another level of actuality vis-a-vis which the Aristotelian essence becomes merely a potential being, okay? Well, it's at that level, metaphysically, where esse is the actuality of an essence which has now been demoted to only potentially existing, not being an eternal being, do you see? Still it's essence in some sense, but it gets a little more complicated, but it's essence fundamentally, right? Well, at that point, that's the metaphysical equivalent of the notion that my actual being now is the act of being that informs my essence and my matter and form in the Aristotelian sense, and without which act of being, which I get by the deliberate will of the Creator, I would be reduced, you could say to non-being ultimately, but on the way to non-being, I would be reduced to a kind of sheer potentiality. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that not only does the Creator God create the totality of the universe, but he creates the totality of everything in the universe because of the Catholic idea, which goes back to the Greeks. In other words, creating the totality as a totality is not an alternative for the omnipotent God to creating totally each of the members of the totality. That's the idea. All right. Now, so to come back to the original thrust of the question as I heard it, in the thinking now occurring, there are a couple of things we're trying to do. And one is to leave behind, or to recognize the leaving behind, the belonging to the past of the self-centered consciousness of modernity. But also, in effect, what's being understood here, and this is in the earlier chapters of Foundation, but it's coming out here in a very dense way in our current readings, where we're doing a conceptual analysis, and we're taking advantage of the Hebrew, and little Greek has already appeared in today's assignment, and the mathematics of that, and so forth, and that's all really working together, you say, to lead the thought forward. And so when we're doing this mathematical reading of the linguistic text or text, what we're doing is we're actually proving out, applying, taking advantage of what is asserted back here about the identity of quantum and the identification of quantum and quality. Do you see? So so implicit, I mean, I don't know, I say implicit, it's at least implicit. If it isn't fully explicit, it ought to be. I think it is, but let's say, implicitly or explicitly, what's going on here is that when we leave behind the self-centeredness of modern consciousness, we leave behind a notion of a self-centered notion of totality, okay, which in the context of thinking now occurring is understood to be somewhat of an abstraction, you see, from the creative power of the creator, right? So in other words, we're really trying to reintroduce, so to speak, what is there in Thomas in a pre-modern way, the Catholicity. So you notice I invented this term Catholicological, to say that's really packed with a lot of stuff, but this would be one way of unpacking it, right? In other words, a logic in which the alternative between the universal totality and the totality of each particular, you see, does not exist, as it were. In other words, in which, in the context of which one would understand that the self-centeredness of modernity, you see, creates a totalitarian understanding of totality, in which, in other words, in which the totalness, if I can put it that way, of the particulars is radically compromised. And I mean, the most egregious and uncompromising compromise of the totality of the particular, to use the language I've wound up using here, is Hegel, you see, for whom the particular as such, the second moment, persis secondness, right? Not really persis secondness, but in that place where you would find secondness, that otherness, that alien moment in the Hegelian creative synthesis, that is what? That has no truth of its own in Hegel, ultimately. In other words, the particular as a particular is ultimately reduced to a nothingness in Hegel, or, as he might otherwise put it more positively, the particular for Hegel has only an ideal existence, by which he means a momentary existence which is only there to be overcome, right? So one of the things so if we're talking about unity and the thinking now occurring, it's not that we're coming upon unity in some unqualified sense, but what we're trying to do is to see unity in a way that it has not hitherto been understood in the history of thought. And one aspect of that is to be able to see what I've called in another context now, an absolute particularity, or as I jumped ahead in the book, we'll come to the text a week or two down the road somewhere, that what we have here is a totality of totalities. And therefore, in that sense, I was saying a couple of times before this, there's no totalization. There's no. You'll pardon me for doing it this way, but I think there's some deep truth in this. There's no monomaniacal notion of unity in the thinking now occurring, but the notion of unity in absolute self-consciousness is, in some literal sense, monomaniacal. See, and so we want to have a kind of perfect, absolute particularization in which, in a new way, right, post-modernity, we understand now in a way that could not be fully understood, but I'm giving you that the formal presuppositions for what's going on now exist in somebody like Thomas, right? That there is that individuals or particulars, be more right, exist absolutely. The significance being not that they don't belong, not that they are not participants in what otherwise could be understand the totality of the universe, but they are, putting it more positively, they are freely participants, right? That what's missing here is the connection idea, which is in Marx. To say, so yes, there's a unity, but the unity, the medium of the unity is not being connected. Okay. Well, what is the medium of unity, which I was noticing in today's assignment, is the unum. Right? But here you have a medium of unity, do you see, which is an absolute medium, right? In other words, in which the those things that otherwise would be understood to be, as it were, outside of the medium, that are joined by it, are integrally the medium, all right? And I was saying something like this in a temporal context, I think last time, right, or the time before, that it's not that there is nothing of the past notion of past, or nothing of the future, the past notion of future. Do you say? But what would be past and future is now an integral part of the absolute now. I hate to give the punchline away, right? But at the end, I was so impressed by this. I love reading my own stuff because I see things I never saw before. At the end of today's assignment, where I'm doing Heidegger on temporality as expectancy and retention and so forth, it dawned on me. It's so simple. Heidegger, and so he does the three. What is it? Retention, expectancy, and whatever that middle one is. I can't remember now. Anyway, he reduces it. The essence of time for Heidegger is expectancy. Okay? Which, by the way, is very good when you think of somebody in the Altizer chapter, in that very intricate kind of ad hoc notation. I really associate Altizer with a kind of co-opting of both Derrida and Heidegger, right? I don't see any discontinuity between what Altizer is doing. And so when I see absolute future popping out in Altizer, you say, and expectancy as the very essence of temporality in Heidegger, I'm not at all surprised, to say. Nor am I surprised that Peirce, the American root of Altizer, the deep American root of Altizer, is a guy who's infinitely postponing the ultimate reality, right? What I would call infinitely postponing absolute particularity. Okay, but what was the punchline? The punchline I came up with, I give it away. All right, the punchline is that where Heidegger puts expectancy, what have we already put? We did this months ago. Instead of expectancy, what? Receptivity. You see, it's beautiful. It's really neat.
Wouldn't have guessed. Good thing you gave it away.
Huh?
Wouldn't have guessed. Good thing you gave it away.
Is that true?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have guessed it.
Oh, okay. But do you see it when I say it? Yeah. Makes sense, right? Well, I didn't see it either. It's okay. We're on this. I only saw it when I read the book. Okay. But that's it, right? So, okay. Let me stop there because we'll go off on a whole topic of unity, but I hope it's helpful. All right, now what I want to do, I have this sense that I've got to get through all this stuff, and I'm going to have to be somewhat selective, but since we started on absence and presence on 375 last time, let's take a quick look at that because I wanted to just take note of something in the, let's see, where is that? Oh, I'm quoting, on 375 I was quoting Altizer there. Third line up from the bottom of 375, therefore presence can now be actual only in its absence. And then he goes on to talk about the door as I and I am the door. And I do some linguistic mathematical stuff with that. But before I turn to any of that, just note that I think I may have noted this, but I want to nail it down. What Altizer says about the door that is I, or the door that is the predicate in I am the door, is that the door opens to nowhere, right? It's that its presence in the form of its absence. And somewhere in here, I don't know whether I can put my finger on it right off the bat, but it's linguistically the case, what's really neat, it's linguistically the case in the Hebrew that the rational product of presence and the rational product of absence are off by 10. Now, the Hebrew rational product that we use for 10 throughout the book here, you may have noticed it a couple times, is truth. Okay? So, in other words, what's being said mathematically, linguistically in the Hebrew is that the truth of presence is absence, right? That these are inextricably bound. This is an oppositional notion. You see? So when Altizer says, as he says elsewhere, quoting him in section 2.4, and then again quoting him here in effect, when Altizer talks, one of the titles of one of his books is Total Presence, he's talking about total presence means to him the God who has self-negated itself And the result of that absolute self-negation on the part of the Godhead is a total presence. But of course, as the language, the mathematical linguistic analysis indicates to us that of course it's the total absence. In other words, the total presence of Althuiser's God who has self-negated himself. Quite fundamental. It's not so much he invented. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is it's not that Althuyser invented the notion that presence is present in its absence, right? What's distinctive in Althuyser is, speaking of total, it's the total presence. It's the total absence of God, or the absence. I might play with it a little bit and say the absence of God, the death of God theology in the context of unity and totality and so forth, is the absence of God from the totality. Do you see? And the absence of God from the totality is what I elsewhere call, and that comes up a little in some future assignment, not too far from now, in Althuyser, the absolute fragmentation of identity, which I distinguish from. And this is a purely semantic distinction. I mean, I'm forced to make it, and I think it's as close as I can get. I probably could do better. But Althuyser's absolute fragmentation of identity, that is the absolute fragmentation of the totality in the wake of total presence, that is, read the total absence of the Creator from the totality, then we have the absolute fragmentation of that totality. You see, the emptying out of the intelligibility and meaningfulness and the structure of it into a kind of bare, fundamentally, well, I'll use his language, inconceivable and undefinable something or other, which more particularly for him is a new humanity, right? But in which each of us is a kind of abstract punctus, an abstract point in time and space. That's what we're left with in Althuyser, in the total presence or the total absence from the totality of the Creator. All right. So, all right. So even Althuyser is working with. I think he's doing it intuitively, right? I mean, I don't think he's not doing this kind of crazy analysis that you have in this book, okay? But that's no accident. I mean, and it's not a personal idiosyncrasy. In other words, this analysis is exactly what is filling that hole, or as it were. It goes back to the blank idea we had. If there were a blank, right? The real point, of course, is we have to be careful. The real point is there's no blank to be filled, right? Because the blank is in the past. But as it were, the blank, the absolute future, the absolutely inconceivable and indefinable new humanity that Althuyser leaves us with, all right? As it were, right? We have this instead of that. That's the best way I can put it, because I don't want to say I'm filling that hole up. Right? The real point is that the hole remains in the past, and there is nothing but existence, as we've said on numerous occasions. Okay. Now, there are many things we could do here, but again, for the sake of economy, let's take a look at the discussion on page 384 in footnote 69. And again, that is also rather extensive. So I just want to note a couple of things there that are fundamental, I think. And that is, Bialy is making an analogy. He's going over Schollem's understanding of the Kabbalists and then the relationship of the Kabbalist tradition to Neoplatonism, and showing certain similarities and dissimilarities. So he says on page 385, the Kabbalists, about 7 or 8 lines down the footnote text, saved creation ex nihilo and God's free will in creating the world by a Gnostic reinterpretation of the concept of nothingness. Nothingness, which was endowed with ontological reality, was not the same as non-being. While seeming to adopt philosophical language, the Kabbalists interpreted creation ex nihilo to mean that God himself is the source of nothingness. Creation ex nihilo paradoxically means creation out of God himself. This doctrine was a synthesis of the traditional concept of creation ex nihilo and the Neoplatonic notion of emanation of the world out of the essence of God. But it was based on a mythical Gnostic view of creation of the world out of the divine abyss. And I think he said elsewhere that, or he will say elsewhere, that this process in the Kabbalistic tradition of what in Neoplatonism would be an emanation out of God, this process of emanation is internalized, right, in the Godhead, and that's one of the points at which we can see the contact of modernity, see the contact of modern self-consciousness implicitly in Descartes. He's not doing that. Descartes' not doing that, right? But once he centers consciousness in the self, he sets up the process by which we move pretty quickly through Kant to Hegel, right? And in Hegel, I think by now we have a sense that for Hegel, the creation of the world is in these terms. It's a kind of it's an absolute internalized process of of infinite self-discovery, right? And to go back to something I was saying earlier, one evidence of that, one proof of that, so to speak, is that the world of appearance, the world in which God is understood by Hegel to be other than himself, alienated from himself, right, has only an ideal existence. You see, it does not, in that sense, stand. If I put it in terms of the thinking now occurring, and I'm not crazy about the words I've said before, for want of a better term, but just comparatively speaking, it does not. The creation in Hegel does not stand independently of God, and the root of that thoroughgoing dependence would be here in the notion that somehow the God creates the world out of himself, as if somehow or other, in a complicated way, right? In some complicated way or other, God is in some sense in the place of not only being the formal cause, but being the material cause of the world. You see what I'm saying? If I put it in Aristotelian terms, do you say? Now that gets finessed by making, as he says there, for example, on 385, Scholem points out, fourth line of the second paragraph, that this solution leads to pantheism, since, as in Neoplatonism, there would be no difference between God and his creation, right? If the world is made out of God, so to speak. To avoid this heresy, such Kabbalists as Azriel of Gerona and Joseph Gikatila introduced a dialectical moment into their speculations. Nothingness is not identical with God, but is rather the name of his first emanation, or sephira, called Keta, crown. Azriel identified this nothingness with the first Neoplatonic emanation representing God's will. Since the first sephira is itself the attribute of God's will, one cannot speak of God's emanating the first sephira by an act of free will. Only the second sephira can be said to be created by God's free will. Since the Bible attributes free will to God as creator, it must be referring to the first sephira and not to the hidden Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, the limitless, formless. I think he points out that Ein can be, I think, somewhere with ayin, the Hebrew for nothing, right? But in other words, there's a kind of mystical. All right, that's what I'm looking at, right? There's an analog. The reason the Kabbalists were doing something like Neoplatonism, because they share with Neoplatonism a notion of a kind of transcendent, what the Neoplatonists would call the transcendent one, Plotinus, that notion, you see. And so there is this interior, ultimate Ein Sof, right, which is prior to the creation. In other words, the Bible never mentions the Deus absconditus because it is only concerned with God's free actions. So there's a distinction made between God the Creator, right, and God, as it were, as he is in himself, but that God as he is in himself is hidden from us. Might be a way of grasping it. All right. Okay. Now, at the bottom of page 386, I quote from Hegel's Science of Logic to show in Hegel himself something of the parallel to what's being discussed by Bialy. And Hegel says in the Science of Logic, the bottom paragraph in the note on 386, logic is to be understood as the system of pure reason, as the realm of pure thought. This realm is truth as it is without veil and in its own absolute nature. It can therefore be said that this content is the exposition of God as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and a finite mind. And then I say, actually, Hegel turns the Kabbalah inside out, but in so doing defines an absolutely unconditioned self-reference in which the non-being of the finite is the being of the absolute. Now, I've used that quote earlier in other contexts, but there's the ultimate pithy statement by Hegel, you see, of what I'm calling in the context of this discussion of the lack of an independence in being, a lack of a status in being on the part of the finite or of the creation as over against the creator, the absolute actuality of nothing reducible to nothing. Okay. Now I thought to pause there, and I made a little note in my margin to tie what I'm saying about Hegel into what has got to be a troublesome phrase throughout this section of the book, nihil ex nihilo, right? I'm talking about it. So when I've been talking hitherto, I've been talking about nothing but existence itself, meaning something like we go so quick that I can't separate where I would have nothing, I have existence itself, right? So I can't really pry those notions apart, right? And here I'm adding kind of linguistically the raison d'etre of that indistinguished. Is there a door there? Are you looking in that direction? Oh, okay. I can't really separate the nothing. So I'm saying the raison d'etre for that is that the nothing but existence itself. Yeah, okay. Sounds better, right? Yes? Terrific.
Keep it down, boys.
The ex nihilo is the adding on or the making explicit of the otherwise indistinguishability, you see, of nothing in existence in the context of the thinking now occurring. So another way of putting that is whatever nothing that one might abstractly consider, if it's ex nihilo, it's kind of paradoxical way of putting it, okay? As I say, I think I said in this section, somewhere in this section, that is last one assignment back, we're trying to play catch-up, that whatever nothing there is a created nothing, to say, but the created nothing is not anything in the thinking now occurring. It is not anything but existence. That is to say, so looking back, right, drawing the distinction, in the past, what is clearly in the thinking now occurring, a nothing ex nihilo, meaning a nothing that has a beginning, a created nothing, which is in turn existence, nothing but existence. In the past, in past thinking, it has been a pre-existent matter. You see, we go back to the distinction that Thomas makes, out of which the world was made. You say? Okay, so there is no. I guess a way of putting it is that there is no material in the thinking now occurring. I think a fair statement would be, summary statement might be that whatever nothing we're dealing with is in no sense a matter. It is in no sense, in classical terms or Thomistic terms, a material cause of anything. Right? If it was thought to be so in the past, that thought was a function of an implicit and or a fully explicit self-consciousness, right? That was able somehow or other, as a reflection, I would say, as a reflection of the nothingness, if you'll pardon the expression, of the self, to project a kind of independent nothing beyond existence, or an independent nothing from which existence was elevated. So in that sense, I'm accusing in a very technical, categorical sense, philosophical sense, even Augustine. You see, that ambiguity in Augustine between ex nihilo and de nihilo, the notion that creation means to him, given the Neoplatonic shape of his mind, right? It means to him something like being raised from nothing into existence. You see, as if there was some kind of, as he puts it, inchoate reality there. That's the way he characterizes that you see that it's a kind of pre-existent, pre-creation nothing, right? Okay, so we want to make a clean break with such a material notion of nothingness. All right. Then I do a little, I don't want to dwell on this, but I point out to you that the language is very helpful here. I would say I was thinking to try and describe what's going on here methodologically. What one is doing here, because one has the conviction conceptually, going back to the early part of the book, that there's no barrier, there's no boundary any longer, right? I mean, I will use the term later on in the book, transmural, in that chapter, which I think, to me, is very powerful. It's about 2 chapters down, we're going to get to a little more of this stuff, and it's going to get, I think, a little deeper. But just to anticipate a little bit the thrust of this, it's already here. It's the notion of, we've said in different contexts, there are no walls any longer. I'm not just speaking geopolitically, you see, but conceptually, logically, ontologically, right? So the barriers between religion and science, faith and knowledge, the barriers between language and number, to say, we know from the early part of this book, before any of this stuff was discovered, right? We know that they don't exist. So why don't we take advantage of that, right? And so what I was about to say in a kind of homely way, what's going on here is the mind is being led by, guided by, allowing itself to be led by the mathematics, do you see, to find in the language, which is traditionally, you see, the language is where we conceptualize things, right? To find the mathematics guiding us into the linguistic conceptual structure, right? So it's an ongoing process of discovery, but its root, in principle, it's grounded, to say, in the identification of quality and quantum and quality. To say, okay. So in that context, now the mystery in Hebrew, that is one of the terms used for the Kabbalah. You see, well, then this mystery on page 387 in the beginning of the long footnote paragraph, it is now transcended in essence in the very form of thought. If it is a mystery, all right, whose rational product is 4.444 times 10 to the fourth, then this mystery is now for the first time essentially and simply mathematical, right? Whose rational product is 444, do you say? 4.44, when denominated by the created 100. That thing we were talking about before, the created 100, rooted in, again, the notion both where the logical analysis, which says that 1 is 1 of 100, just as 1 is 1 of 36, that whole notion of the totality of the elements of the absolute proportion of absolute thought, right? All of which comes out directly and exclusively out of a logical mathematical analysis. When I look at the Hebrew for to create, do you see, which, by the way, is the word which is not used about human creation, by the way. All right? In other words, in the Bible, bara is used only of the divine creation. So it's a rather specific term for creation. And there I notice that that the rational product is 100th. Okay? By the way, there's a note on this in response to something Bill said on the forum, too. But I don't want to get off on it now, but there's a little more on that, too. So here the logic and the language and the mathematics of the logic and the mathematics of the language converge in this notion. And so here again we have that convergence, you see, and all of which tends to make explicit something that, I want to say in a very detailed and specific way, what in a certain sense less specific way ought to be the case, right? So here we have a kind of working out of that. All right, now the keter, all right, and so now conceptually, what the thinking now occurring wants to get rid of, or what wants to leave in the past, is not only a self-centeredness, but also the notion, and therefore not only the Neoplatonic notion of emanations, but also the Kabbalistic notion of sephirah, right? The notion that there are these sequence of attributes. All right. So you could say, what's going on in thinking now occurring, this will become again explicit. I've already anticipated it linguistically in earlier classes. The absolutely flat structure of the universe, the flattening out, right? The lack of depth, to say. So if you think of emanations, or if you think of the Kabbalistic structure of the various attributes of the Godhead arranged in some sort of sequence, 1 through 10, that type of thing. What essentially is being done, the thing now occurring, is to reduce, as it were, the depth of that notion, if I can put it that way, to one sephirah, right? So to one. And so here the keter, the absolute keter, the crown in Kabbalistic terms, is taken to be the absolute truth. So about 5 or 6 lines from the bottom of the footnote paragraph on 387, the absolute keter is the absolute truth identified as to create. This is the creation of the groundless. And here I thought also to pause, right? In other words, all right, I want to bring these the two parts of this footnote at the very bottom of 386 and what I've just paused on in 387, I'll put them together. Notice at the bottom of 386, when I'm talking about Hegel as the epitome of absolute self-consciousness, I say there, at the bottom of 386, the absolute actuality of nothing reducible to nothing. And the contrast to that, which got me off on the ex nihilo thing, which I didn't finish my thought at that point, is that in the thinking now occurring, you could rewrite that, the absolute actuality of nothing, irreducible to nothing. Because the absolute actuality of nothing, irreducible to nothing, would be a nice thinking now occurring translation of existence, nothing ex nihilo. Right? The absolute actuality of nothing, but irreducible to nothing. Okay? Or, so where I've been saying nothing but existence, I might say nothing but absolute actuality. You see? Okay? Now, but I want to tie that in with my selection here in Kabbalistic terms. Why do I bother with this, right? In other words, because I want to make the relationship. I want to say that there is a relationship. It's a negative relationship if you want, or more precisely, it's a relationship in which what was the case is no longer the case. Right? So it's not a self-negation negative. Okay, so the keta then is understood here as the absolute truth identified as to create. This is the creation of the groundless. And so when I say that creation, what I'm saying here in effect is that creation is understood, and this comes out in a purely conceptual linguistic mode, I think in the very last chapter of this book in another context, bringing in Hegel and Altizer and so forth and so on, after we've gone through the American philosophers later in the book, the notion that nothing but existence, nothing but absolute actuality, you see, that creation here is the creation of the groundless. In other words, I could almost say, I think a little bit of Heidegger. He's into the ground and the Abgrund and so forth. But of course, his Abgrund, this is the problem. He also goes beneath the ground. Right? He's got a kind of groundlessness. You see, it's the Abgrund. It reminds me a little bit of what probably Altizer, again, subliminally learned this from Heidegger, right? It's what happens when the Godhead is absent. Right? The presence is the absence. Right? Well, so the ground, right, which is withdrawn in Heidegger, is the Abgrund. Right? It's the withdrawal of the ground now becomes the ground in Heidegger. It's an analog to what's going on in Altizer's Death of God theology. Actually, the analog works the other way around historically. Okay, but what I'm getting at is creation in the context of the thinking now occurring. Nothing but existence, nothing but absolute actuality. Any introduction of any notion of a ground here, you see, would be not only redundant, but it would be a return to the past. Do you see? It would be. So somebody asked, I think it was Voltraut. I don't know if she ever got a satisfactory answer, but but the title of the book is Foundation. Do you see? And you could ask questions similar to the ones that were asked about the subtitle to Novitas Mundi. Perception of the history of being. Perception, not a perception, not the perception. You see? Okay. Well, you could make the analogous point here. Not a foundation, not the foundation. I want to say there's nothing but foundation. But nothing but foundation means what? It means we're creating the world. Just say, in other words, nothing but foundations is to say nothing but text. Nothing but text. Therefore, as I was saying last time, we agree, the thinking now occurring, we agree with Derrida, language does not signify, but we're not in despair about that. We're not in the desperate straits that Derrida is in, that language doesn't signify, as if, gee, it just keeps trying to signify, right, and keeps failing, right? It doesn't signify because it's it. It doesn't signify, it's not a deficit that language doesn't signify. It's because that language is essentially identical with the thing. And you could say vice versa if you want. You could, run the film backwards. It comes to the same thing, right? Because if there's no depth, backwards and forwards is, in this sense, somewhat relative. Okay, so the selection of the Kedah here is to select the moment in Kabbalistic language of creation, you say, but to emphasize that this moment of creation is the creation of the groundless, right? There's an absolute immediacy. And so then I say, the existence of nothing after nothing. Oh, and so when I anglicize, which is Thomas's point in Latin, I guess he would say post, okay, that X means post. It doesn't mean day. It doesn't mean out of, right? It's not a material clause. It's merely a order arrangement. So then I say in English, the existence of nothing after nothing, okay? Or as I said in an earlier section we've been through, the absolute after identity, right? The absolute after identity of thought, okay? Okay, and that what I was trying to get at with in different mathematical ways, it comes up implicitly in what we're doing today too. But in other words, so therefore it's very different. That's why I trip on the word, the negative, or the negation here, and that's why it's a little bit problematic linguistically, but as long as we understand what we're talking about, it's not really a problem. In other words, if I say that we're not thinking the way Hegel thinks, we're not sublating Hegel. We're not doing what Hegel postulates in the Faith and Philosophy in the appendix, right? That the only way you can get beyond Hegel is to get beyond Hegel in a Hegelian way, and therefore you're trapped, right? So and of course we would be trapped. You see, if we had to negate, right, if we have in some way to deny the ultimate, this is, and so I'm crazy because I have to start off by saying there is real truth in the death of God theology. I have to say there is real truth in Hegel. I don't have to say, as Hegel would have to say, that Hegel has no truth of his own. He has a truth of his own, damn well does. Do you see? And so, by the way, I don't want to be parochial here. And so does Thomas, and so does Augustine, right? And so, I guess, so does Aristotle and Plato. They have a truth of their own. And so how can I reconcile that? Because I have to take with ultimate seriousness this thing called history. Do you see? And history, where history is essentially change. So if I take history with utter seriousness, I don't have to say these guys were wrong, false in any simple sense, you see what I'm saying? But I can negate them, not in this self-conscious sense, but I can negate it in the form of the negation, which is accurate without taking anything away from the truth of the death of God theology, is to say that it belongs to the past. All right, so, okay. Now,
Can I
yeah,
make a comment?
sure.
How do you know that somebody else other than you, who thinks in a Hegelian, Augustinian, Aristotelian, Kabbalistic way, who takes into account in a way not known to you, all kinds of other matter, but not in the past, is also still not expounding his truth? That's other than thinking now occurring. In other words, how does your relegating these things to the past guarantee you a negation of thinking happening now that you don't know about. In other words, you've taken relegating to the past as your version of negation and said it's something other than Hegelian negation.
Right.
But it functions as that negation because it makes you think that you can negate that which you don't know about.
I don't. That's where I was going to. That's why I was going to interrupt your analysis.
Or in Sri Lanka.
I have no need.
Bronx,
but I'm not negating what I don't know about.
Well, okay. Then,
I have no warrant to do that.
But why then?
If there's somebody in Sri Lanka who is doing something that appears not to be the thing now occurring, by the premise.
Like this.
Yeah, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there is such a person.
A major tradition of the Chinese history of philosophy, plus the Indian history of philosophy, plus the Japanese history of philosophy, plus a dozen other matters, and the way in which Western history is reflected. I know very well that there's an elaborate reflection of Western philosophy in India. I don't know whether it's happened in China too, but it sure as hell happened in India. And I have no way of knowing whether the outcome of that isn't as sharp, as powerful, as whatever, as the thinking now occurs.
Right. Well, we can't. It's hard to talk about an unknown. So if we have a candidate. I don't mean you should introduce it. We're talking in principle. I'm saying my principled answer to you is, if you have a candidate for, with as it were, a rival claim to whatever, present it and we'll take a look at it.
No. The point would be not that it's a rival claim, but that it has the same kind of otherness as the otherness of the discontinuous circle that you grant to a multiplicity of individuals.
Then all it does is prove the point. Then. I'm saying there's a new universal consciousness, and if you're telling me that there is somewhere in the world, unknowns to either one of us at the moment, perhaps a thinking which has the essentially same understanding, identical understanding, fine.
Then what I'm saying is that which is other than thinking now occurring is
but
not
it wouldn't
necessarily, wait a minute, it's not necessarily the negation that's inherent in relegating to the past. You're saying that you have, instead of a Hegelian negation.
Right.
You say this is in the past.
Right.
And actually, the way you have dealt with each time somebody has brought some notion from contemporary thought up to you, your perception of it is to relegate it to the past.
Well, I was going to say there's another level of this discussion when we talk about now and past, and that is that. When I speak of the thinking now occurring, and this came up like on day one of Novitas Mundi with, I think, Nancy's question, what do we mean by now occurring, right? It's not simply now occurring in clock time, although I don't necessarily exclude that, but what I'm saying is not limited to that notion. So if I can speak in a quasi-Heideggerian way of, in other words, the difference between what we're talking about, the thinking now occurring, has to do, as I already pointed out in a totally different context, going from the Heideggerian notion of temporality as expectancy, to temporality as receptivity. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that the now I'm talking about is not limited to world time, external clock time, but the thinking now occurring goes to the very essence of the structure of consciousness, right? In other words, it's a radically new. I don't like the word radical. I have to say, I like an essentially conditioning. It's not technically. I mean, I don't mind the word radical in conversation, but it's technically misleading because it's just a root. It's an essentially, right? So in other words, the now is an essentially new concept of temporality. So I want to pause there. Okay. Now, what I want to take a look at, because it ties in actually with today's assignment, on page 379 and following. Wait a minute, am I going back? Well, wait a minute.
387.
No, I didn't. Did I?
387 is where that long footnote continues.
Okay. All right, then I won't go back now. We'll go back when we get to today's assignment on that point. All right. On 3 I think probably because this part of the last assignment pretty much moves over pretty closely into today's assignment. On page 392 and following, we have a kind of reprise of the issue that comes up, actually introduced by Derrida in section 2.3, what I call the Derrida chapter. It has to do with Derrida's introduction of the notion of the hymen, which in this particular selection that I quote from, he deals with rather extensively and in a fairly accessible way in terms of what I want to say about the relationship of the thinking now occurring to what he has to say. It's in this section, 392 and following, that one can, this issue of signification comes up, right? And he denies that that the language is, as he says, a true sign or a signifier. So let's just take a look a little bit at the text here from dissemination in the footnote on page 392. If there is text, if the hymen constitutes itself as a textual trace, hymen having the conceptual notion of a barrier, of a demarcator of two things that are separated by it, right? It could be inside and outside. It could be either or, right? On many different levels. So if it always leaves something, and so what he's saying is that the text has this kind of, what I want to say, it has this kind of two-sided, to say, undecidable nature. That's what he wants to say, and that's, right? So if there is text, if the hymen constitutes itself as a textual trace, if it always leaves something behind, it is because its undecidability cuts it off from, prevents it from depending on every and hence any signified, whether antithetic or synthetic. Its textuality would not be irreducible if through the necessities of its functioning it did not do without deprivation and or independence. The hymen is the structure of and or, so that's his way of defining it. It's that which is, in effect, is what he's saying, between and an or. And therefore, just in writing terms, which is, writing is where he's at, you understand? Everything is writing in a in a primordial sense, if you want, for him. Everything is text, okay? So it's not at all incidental to note that what I have between and or is the slash, you see? And that slash mark would be a kind of brief visual index of the hymen, you see, of the wall, if I use language that I'm comfortable with, of the wall between this and that. I'm going to say this technically before we finish the class, I'm sure. But I mean, I had this tremendous sense of rereading this material, today's assignment particularly, where I get into the absolute penetration of using the language of Yahweh, King of Israel, and the Holy Virgin, right? Take the Creator and the creature. But the Holy Virgin, you see, goes back. Derrida triggers all of this. But you see, Derrida triggers all of this. Is he crazy to be talking about the hymen? Is he a madman? What's he talking about? See? In other words, he's just unearthed something. Do you see? In his own way, he's unearthed this fundamental structure of what he calls undecidability. Right? But it's undecidable because it remains as an impervious membrane. It remains as an effective differentiation between this and that. Do you see? Between either this or that. You see? To go back to the broader notion of what I call the logic of subjectivity, which is overcome. So the whole thing, all this intricate stuff about person, the two and the three, and then I use the Hebrew to show that when I follow Maimonides, when the Lord says, I am who I am, or I am that I am, that if I translate that, if I allow the mathematics of the language to guide me with a little help from Maimonides as to the proper breakdown of the syntax, I find I am that I am ultimately, mathematically, 1 equals 2/3, right? And wow, because all the stuff in the logic about the material exchange of the identity of 2 and 3 had nothing to do with that. It was done before any such notion, you see. So what I'm just giving you another little example. In other words, what we're talking about here at first strikes seems strange, right? And if I pick up Derrida's text, he's talking about the textual embodiment of the hymen. Why is he doing that? See, but obviously, when I take it seriously. Well, the great thing you have to do when you're doing the history of thought is, if you have reason to believe this guy is not crazy, then go with it. You know what I'm saying? Go with it. All right. So if he wants to talk about the hymen, all right, fine. Let's talk about the hymen. So we talk about the hymen, and then what do I find? I find in the Hebrew, hey, it fits. It works. It makes lots of sense. The notion of virginity, the fact that there's a virgin birth as a central doctrine of Christianity. Why was that necessary? What's the point? You see? And then if I do my linguistic thing, and I got an absolute penetration of the creator and the creature qua virgin, do you see? Well, that makes a lot of, that's certainly, that I know conceptually long before I get to this, you see? Here I have a kind of a working out in detail, a kind of way of focusing on some of the specifics, do you see? So where the concept and the language and the mathematics are all in agreement with one another, as it were. Okay. All right, so...
Before we get it all in agreement, what is this actually saying? Because it is saying something. The notion of the text is trace, and it's being cut off from the signified.
Right.
There is something that you can focus on as to what he's saying there, right?
He
doesn't require all of these equations that you find.
Oh, no.
It's not just that it's crazy. There's something...
No. Well, yeah. Well, what he's saying, he says, I've already anticipated, but I haven't gotten to it in the text. He says, after the and/or part of that paragraph, a little above the middle of that top paragraph in the footnote, the hymen is the structure of and/or, between and or, its refill of signified in the movement through which it leaps from one to the other. Thus, strictly speaking, it is not a true sign. What he's saying, all right. What he's saying is that the text, which is supposed to refer to Aunt Molly, never gets back to Aunt Molly. He's already said it in chapter 2-3, right? It never gets back to the flesh and blood. In other words, the flesh and what he wants to say is flesh and blood is a text. And in a certain way, I'm saying the thinking now occurring is agreeing with that, right? The flesh and blood is a text, but not in this sense of an infinite regress, not in the sense that I'm perpetually at a loss for the signified, right? If there's only one level of text, if I flatten the text out, you see, if there's not a text behind the text, which, by the way, is a kind of inverse and perverse Kabbalistic series of emanations, right? If I flatten the text out, then I have only to do what? I could say, now here I'll take advantage of what Altizer does. I have then only to hear the text, which is the text speaking, or I have only to say the text, which is to make the text, right? In other words, again, if I radically get beyond the notion of the hymen as a barrier, a marker of undecidability, to say that is if I say taking that as a negative belongs to the past, if I take it, so the thinking now occurring would say, well, all right, you say undecidability, and I get this sense that, it's an endless something or other, an endless regress. Well, undecidability, if I take it as something apart from the person whose identity is the text itself, if I take it as apart from that, but if I take the text itself as the identity of the person, then what in the past would be the undecidability of the text becomes what? And here I'm just going to use the wrong word just to make the point, and then we'll polish it. It becomes the opportunity to create the world. What you call undecidability is not undecidability, it's I decide. I decide. And I don't decide in the way of interpretation. as if the text was written by somebody else, and I have to figure out what they meant. Do you see? So I decide what the text. Yeah. So you want to say undecidable? I don't. It would not.
So you're agreeing with the critique of polysemy, because he's going to say in a minute that it is this hermeneutic concept of polysemy that must be replaced by dissemination, and so you're accepting that this hermeneutic concept of polysemy must be replaced, but it isn't dissemination that's the image for what it has to be replaced by.
I think I don't agree that many meanings, right?
Well, the hermeneutic concept of polysemy would be that there is a text which has many meanings.
Yes. Okay.
And what he is saying is, it's not that it has many meanings. It starts this endless process
Yes.
of scattering,
Right.
which comes to nothing, or comes to its own infinite.
Right.
He has some various words for it, but this
Yeah.
infinite scattering,
Supplementarity.
of meaning. And what you're saying is that it becomes the opportunity for creation rather than for this mere scattering. But you're agreeing that there is no text in back of the text.
There's no text
which holds all of these meanings into some kind of ideal order.
Yes, and in that sense, I think I've said I agree. There's no signified, right?
Yeah, if the
Okay.
signified stands for
Right.
what the process of unraveling the polysemy,
Right.
polysemy meaning multiple meanings.
Okay.
That those multiple meanings are organized by a signifier, so that the text has an ultimate meaning, which is the responsibility of hermeneutics to unearth.
Right.
You're agreeing with him that there is no such responsibility, there is no such organization of the multiple meanings by the
Prior.
signified, but there is an act of
Right.
creativity
Right.
which can make use of this multiplication of meanings for creative purposes. Yes?
No.
No. Oh, wow, okay.
Close.
Yeah,
Well,
what's
first
the
of all,
next
strictly speaking, it's like. By the way, I used the word opportunity, and I did so acknowledging as I left my mouth. It was the wrong word. So when you fed it back to me, I thought.
You got to cut it out. Yeah.
Well, no. Well, yes, but rather than the opportunity to create, the proper word that I really should have used is the imperative to create. Okay, in other words, and the reason it's imperative, I mean, you could say, now I can bring a little bit of the Kierkegaardian feel into the thinking now occurring, right? Existentially, it's if knowledge, if thinking, if science, logic, thinking now for the first time in history is not an alternative to faith, and faith is not an alternative to logic, then when Kierkegaard gives me his man of faith who's out there, walking on water over 70,000 fathoms, I think is his famous metaphor, right? And not to pedestrianize the idea or not. I mean, basically either you have faith or you sink, okay? Or to put it in more earthly terms, it's sink or swim, okay? Okay. Well, even that is not quite right, but that's the thrust. In other words, if there is a text behind which there's no pre-existent organizing signified, if the text itself is identically I, right, then I not only have the opportunity to create the text, right, the world, essentially, but I have the imperative to do so, because you could say I have, and I think I've said this in a totally different context, I have no choice but to create the world.
You're already doing it.
I'm already doing it. Yeah, right. I'm already doing it, and the sooner I can focus in on the absolute immediacy, do you see, of the again, I want to clean this up, of my creation of the text, the better off I'll be. Right?
Otherwise, you're going to sink into dissemination.
Okay.
That's an alternative. There may be others, but it's surely one of the things that
or sink into the past.
Yeah.
Or into the future. Okay. All right. So now he.
Flotsam.
Okay. All right, so I say in this context, after following him through on the next page, the footnote 393, and by the way, that or, the French, probably in English, it functions, I think he identifies it, or Mallarmé does, I forget which one says it. It's a kind of, I think it must be Derrida.
Well, it's Mallarmé.
No, I mean, it's, yeah, he's using it, but I don't know who's commenting that it's a, I don't remember who's commenting that it's a conjunction. The equivalent in English is when you start a paragraph or a new sentence off by saying now, right, which I kind of liked. Right? Okay, so now, oh, there it is, right? The second paragraph up. Now, isn't it precisely such writing on abim, this abysmal writing, writing in the abyss? Oh, so another way of saying that we don't have a meaningless, or we don't have an indefinite, undecidable regress, right? That's an abysmal notion of what is called then the undecidability of the particularity. Has got to be some sort of poly, right? Should I invent the word a polyontology, right? Hey, I like that, right? Okay, polyontology. Hey, I like it. I like it. I'm going to think about that. I'm not stuck with it now. I'm just
Ontopolyology.
A polyontology. It's got a kind of. You could do something with that. You can go a little dance music to that paleontology. Okay.
Kids program.
But the point being, the multiplicity. Do you see the particularity, the explosion of identity as opposed to the fragmentation of identity in all types. The explosion of identity, meaning the absolute multiplication of identity in the thinking now occurring, which has a technical logical meaning, absolute multiplication, unum. That's good. The samey part, that's suspect, because that's sign, that's meaning, that's another, right? Now I want to get, if the text is the absolute existent, right?
Well, it's interesting because there are two roots that are the same.
Okay.
He's got polysemy,
right,
which is semiotic sign.
Right.
And then he has dissemination, but where the sem is from semen.
Yeah, the seed.
So what's the actual? That's an interesting Greek pun there.
Okay.
That the
Well, now you're making me think of the virgin birth in a whole new light. Right. So this would be beyond not only dissemination but beyond semination. And therefore beyond the notion of radicalness in the sense in which I keep tripping over it, beyond the sense of what is a rat? The radical is the root. It's right in some sense the seed of the plant. Out of that which it comes, you plant the seed and it takes root and comes from it. Right. So that the thinking now occurring in its own outrageous way, right, means to be. Look at that. Means to be. It is. It doesn't mean to be. Say I'm being too polite. Right. It doesn't mean, so I'm just saying, it is beyond the radical. It's beyond semination and dissemination, I guess what you would say.
So dissemination means the scattering of the seeds is like this, like the seeds from a tree, blown in the wind.
Yeah. Well, I don't know now. I don't want to get hung up in this, but I mean, it just occurs to me something worth exploring is Hegel as the seminator. And Derrida as the disseminator, right? The guy who puts Hegel up against the wall. Okay, well, you can meditate on that.
Well, but
go on.
So what I want to hold you to what you're saying here. There is something that's coming in this place. Derrida is replacing polysemy with dissemination.
Right.
And you're wanting to go a little deeper in the displacement. What's being displaced is this entire complex of roots, including the meta root of root itself.
Right, that's right.
But what's the movement? What's the creative movement that's coming within this bracket, in brackets, or under an X?
Well, I mean, I know I made a little joke out of it, but it's a polyontology. It's a multiplicity in being that is absolutely immediate and creative. That is the text itself, and that if we put it in terms of temporality, exists in the context of the identity of existence as absolute now for the first time.
But the actual creative multiplication that occurs relative to a text is something that you're sort of doing. You're not taking roots in the etymological sense, but you are doing something like that. That is to say, you're invading the interstices of the language and producing other sets of relations that are internal to it, such that new being can occur. And it doesn't seem to me that that's radically unsemiological or semiogonic in the sense that you're taking the language that appears are receptive to it and allowing it to multiply its ontological advantage. So that's not completely...
Did you use the word receptive just then?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm with you.
I'm hip.
Okay.
But the receptivity is receptivity to something that is the fragmentation of the what? It's the negredo. It's the to get alchemical about it. It's the corruption from which life occurs. It's the death of the seed. Going back to biblical material, it's unless it die, that the seed must die so that its new possibilities can, in fact, be disseminated. And here, disseminated not in a chaotic, scattered sense, but in an orchestrated agricultural sense of the new planting, the new growth, the new creativity. So I'm just sort of like holding back to some of the richness of these metaphors that can be still pulled in a direction that's other than the direction that Derrida pulls it, and that is really, it is certainly biblical.
Okay, but thinking now occurring, resist those
but it's still, I'm not sure.
Longings.
No, but I don't have those longings really. I'm just taking advantage of what's there, and I'm saying that sometimes when you want to, I'm not sure that you're doing something that's as radically different from this polysemy dissemination.
I understand.
Giving it a third direction, which is corrective, as it were, of these others, but is part of the same family of novation.
Well,
hermeneutics.
but there's not much I can say to that except that I suppose possibly you could be correct, but that's not.
I'm sorry. I'm just going from my own working of these these grounds in terms of my own creativity.
Okay. All right. Now this.
Actually, at the bottom of that quote. And,
which page you on now?
393, and I'm not sure whether you had
Okay.
done what you wanted to say because you got misled over.
Oh yeah. You're right. You're right. You're right. Okay. Can never to the letter. The abyss will never have the glint of a phenomenon because it becomes black or white, the one and or the other in the squaring of writing. And then I say, but for the first time, the one is the other, absolutely. Now that is the most comprehensive, one of the ways in which you can most comprehensively, succinctly state the thinking now occurring, right? The what, the slash, the hymen, the undecidable text is absolute. Therefore, it is not undecidable, or it's to be decided imperatively by me. If I'm going to put it that way. I'm not crazy about the word me, but it's okay.
In the now.
The I, in the now, right? Okay, in the now, or by the I, maybe a better way of putting it. It is not a question of black and white. It is not a question of black or white. Dropping down a few to the bottom line, the very bottom line, in the absolute hymen, again, as an index, the one is absolutely the other. Black is absolutely white. Not only is there no and, not simply has the self changed into the other, as in the absolute inversion of the abyss, but that's a reference to Altizer, right? God becomes his own other, right? And he really changes into that other. So that's not what we're talking about here. But there is no looking back over one's shoulder into the future. So the alternatives now. So Chuck's without. I don't want to stir you up again, but just to draw the connection here. The ors that Chuck keeps bringing up, or somebody in Sri Lanka, somebody in China, or another. This is another version maybe of semination or something. Okay. Well, it's hard to know what to say to that, except that in the thinking now occurring, those questions don't really have a place in the thinking, because the thinking is the overcoming of this of this looking over one shoulder or looking to the side or this. What's the word? I want to say, because one of the terms that comes up when I get to the society and the sociability and the impact of this, in other words, this absolute particularity is not an absolute atomization. It's the ground of an absolutely social identity, absolutely social, as opposed to a social identity which is either via connection, in the case of Marxism, or via some kind of formal identity, I think, in the case of American thought. That's going to be explored later on, I think. So there is an essential sociability. I lost where I was going with that.
You're absolutely right with the abyss.
Yeah. The absence of the ors, the absence of alternatives. If you say, well, what's new or what's in place of that? It's fundamentally the absence of all either or, of all hymen as undecidability or barrier or separation. What's in place of it is an absolute, what I call absolute particularity. I can call it absolute differentiation, do you see? Or absolute otherness, I think it's a very simple way of putting it. An absolute otherness in which the multiplicity, the polyontology of others, right? The polyontological status of others, you see, is grounded in freedom. If it's, but what kind of a ground is that? You see what I'm saying? Freedom is precisely, ask Sartre. It's precise when you experience freedom. What you experience is precisely the groundlessness of your situation. Do you see? And in a self-conscious world, if I'm Sartre, what do? I suffer anguish. I experience vertigo. Do you see? Well, imagine a freedom, an absolutely groundless situation in which what's missing, do you see, is not your freedom, but what's missing is your self-consciousness. Why would you get dizzy? You would not get dizzy. You'd just be doing whatever you're doing. You'd just be free. Okay, it's something like that. Okay, I jumped ahead in my thought to the latter part of today's assignment, where the absolute sociability, absolute society. Okay, but I'm just going to leave it hang there until I can pick it up again. Now, there's a lot of technical stuff in here which I'm not going to select out unless anybody has a particular problem.
I just have a quick comment question for you,
Sure.
Chuck, which is, in reading over this, I started to think about the relationship between the Hyman and G. Spencer Brown's little cut, his first division thing.
The mark or whatever.
Is that what it's called? Chuck, what's it
The
called?
first distinction or the mark of distinction?
Yeah, the mark of distinction, the first distinction. There's just something there that would be fun to pursue at the back of our minds. That it's open and division at the same time. The mark itself is open. It looks like, right?
An angle, little right angle.
This. So you move everything. That's what the mark is. So it makes a division and it's open.
Well, not only that, but the sequence of the marks of distinction are always traceable. So though it looks like what you're doing is creating absolute identities that are fixed, in fact they're not fixed. because they're only the history of their own
Right.
procedure.
Right. So anyway, just for whoever's thinking about Steve Spencer Brown in the back of their minds,
Okay.
it's what came up, I don't want to make a big diversion.
All right, well, we'll keep-
I've been avoiding mentioning that.
Okay. Well, we'll keep it in the back of our minds for the time being. Let's just take a look, however, on page 396. It's still the continuation of this long footnote, but it's a point where the concept comes to the fore, which I think is the most important thing for us to do. In the first paragraph beginning in the footnote on 396, now, absolute proportion distinguished qua identity from absolute solitude. And so another thing I've been doing in here, without probably on the preceding page or thereabouts, looking at, you remember when I was doing the ad hoc analysis of Altizer in what I call the Altizer chapter 2-4, I pointed out, again, one of these things I only discovered in rereading this text in the context of this course, that I had actually set up in that notation Altizer to equal k squared times m squared, and then when I abstracted that, I said, well, wait a minute, m squared is essentially historical materialism. It's what, right? It's the thinking now occurring. And so when I look back at that notation, I was really gratified to see, well, yes, that explains how can Altizer and I be otherwise, I say I, right? The big I here. So apparently so many certain level of similarity, right? Or how can I honestly, intellectually now I'm talking, value the truth of the death of God theology embodied in all? How is that possible? Because what's you know what it is? This is a little play on Altizer. What's missing in Altizer is the presence of the past, right? Better. What's missing in Altizer is the removal of the past. To say he's got the k squared, he's got Hegel stuck there together with, which if they were not stuck together, would be the absolute now. You say, which would be the essentially historical materialism. So, in that context, so here I'm saying analogously. It's an analogy because I'm using a slightly different language here because his one way he expresses he's very good this way. He has many different ways of saying his thing, and one of the ways in which he focuses in on this total presence is the sense of absolute solitude, right? So in effect, therefore, by analogy, what I'm saying is that the absolute solitude, if it could be disconnected from the notion of absolute proportion, or if instead of, might be better, instead of the absolute solitude that he leaves us with, you say, it could be replaced. It can't be, you see, actually concurrently. It can only be if the absolute solitude is left behind. Okay, but as it were, what replaces it, you say, is precisely proportionality, or in his own language, what replaces it is precisely a conceptualization and definition of the new humanity, or a conceptualization and definition of the new world. You say that's fundamentally what's going on. So here I'm taking advantage of the language a little bit again. So if absolute proportion in the Hebrew could be distinguished from absolute solitude, qua identity from absolute solitude, it's absolute dissemination at once itself in the Hebrew absolute writing. You see, this is very interesting that the Hebrew is really supporting Derrida too, as far as that goes, right? The conjunction of the notion of dissemination and his focus on the ur-text, ur-writing, right? Again, but do you find what I'm going to call for shorthand, this crazy analysis in Derrida? No, you wouldn't find it. Why? Because he's expecting to be disappointed. What's missing in Derrida is analogously what's missing in. He's expecting. Is that a pun? He's expecting. Okay.
In the context.
Yeah. Well, he hasn't given birth. Okay, so he is expecting, right? And time is expectancy is short of giving birth. And I think of Levinas here. I just want to bring him in, do him justice. He's profound because he's still modern, see, and he's trying to do a critique of modern self-consciousness in its worldly, juridical consciousness thing. So he goes back beyond consciousness to a point beyond See, he goes back before the beginning. So Levinas and the thinking now occurring have, again, points of contact. You wouldn't be surprised, right? But what Levinas cannot, this is another pun, what he can't stomach, right, is the beginning. He has to be prior to the beginning in order to do a critique of consciousness, right? Now, here's the point. You get back before the beginning in Levinas. Now you're back in a pre-consciousness world, in a kind of pre-phenomenological pre-consciousness, in which one finds the self bound in an immemorial state. I mean, if it were Aristotle, it would be eternally, right? But it doesn't apply. Eternal is too metaphysical a language. But one is from some immemorial past, bound to the other in the sense of being absolutely responsible for the other. And this is, now here's the point, this is a burden for the self, but it's being caught out, is his expression, by the self is being caught out by the other, and that is the pre-conscious, pre-phenomenological, what's his word for it? His word for time, diachronous, is that it? Do I have that right?
Yeah.
Huh? Yes?
Well,
is that the term?
Well, diachronous means this way, not contemporary.
Yeah. No, it's diachronous. It's a kind of,
as opposed to
it's a kind of radical discontinuity of time in its own way. But here's the point. And he analogizes this, but this is no accidental analogy again. See? We're all crazy. I mean, hey, I'm crazy. Levinas is crazy. We're all crazy. And the craziness is that when he tries to find a serious metaphor for this immemorial, pre-conscious being caught out and burdened with the this is my language, I'm jazzing it up a little bit, absolutely unshiftable burden of the other. Do you know what he uses? Maternity. It's when you're pregnant. We're talking, this would maybe think of this. In other words, the problem in Levinas, now, of course, the problem in Levinas, for him, this problem is, he makes the best of this, right? In other words, but the relationship between the self and the other in this pre-phenomenological, pre-consciousness state is as if, it's like if you were, some of you have been pregnant, right? So it's as if, imagine being pregnant, but you can never remember not being pregnant, and you're never going to give birth. Try that in about 8.5 months, right? You know what I'm saying? Okay? So nature says, oh, I'm ready, right? Okay. But what Levinas is saying is, that's a relief. Giving birth is a relief. So he takes the perpetual, for want of a better term, the perpetual pregnancy, do you see? The perpetual, so what Heidegger would call, because don't forget he was a Heideggerian, right? When did you tell me?
In my Catholic church, and I live in the Sacred Church of the Perpetual Pregnancy.
Well, okay. Well, I don't know about, I'm not going to go there. But the point I want to make is that, in other words, I'm saying that in the thinking now occurring, as I said in 2.3, where I was doing the first go at Derrida, is that what we now have is the hymen intact, or in the language, the linguistic analysis, mathematical, the absolute hymen, where the child is born. Right? In other words, the hymen intact, the virgin birth, right? Where the child is born without the destruction of the hymen. So the hymen's significance, therefore, will have had to have been absolutely transformed, entirely different significance, right? Which I call the text itself of existence. Okay, but what I'm getting at, so now I discovered, with further support from Levinas, what I said accidentally, you see, but not an accident, because Derrida, Heidegger, Levinas, they're all on the same ship. They're in different parts of the ship, right? Different decks and so forth. They're in the ship in which, as becomes articulated very profoundly by Heidegger, they're in the ship, the engine of which is expectation. Right? Just say, the engine of which is the future, is the modern project. Right? The thinking now occurring is the realization. It's the birth, right? It's the end of expectancy. And I think, by the way, I don't want to beat this to death, but after your state of expecting is over, what happens? The nurse hands you the kid, right? You receive the child, right? You go from a state of expectancy to a state of receptivity. You see, you really do. And by the way, if you're a healthy parent, you don't have any choice but to take care of the kid. You see, you don't have a choice. There's an imperative there. Do you see? At 3 a.m, whether you like it or not, it makes no difference, right? You see? So the absolute imperative of existence, right, to create. Do you see? The absolute imperative to create, the absolute imperative to take care of what is now, for the first time in history, born. We're no longer waiting. You see? And now we have to take care of the kid. Now we have to take care of, and the kid, you could say, Hegel would like this in a totally different context. The kid is the world, right? Jim, if he were here, he'd give me this stuff about God got bored with Christmas, okay? But what Christmas is the newborn infant, you say? Well, once the infant is born, you have to take care of the infant, right? You have no choice. Yeah.
There's this, I've mentioned this before.
Okay.
It's a kind of permanent fixture, as it were.
Okay.
Part, really, is the Meister Eckhart sermon about being a virgin and a mother. A virgin and a wife.
Yeah.
And it's about the perpetual birth of Christ in the heart.
Okay.
That's the eternal moment in the now.
Okay.
And it's completely about this question of the unbroken hymen and at the same time the endless renewal, the permanent renewal of the actuality of the creative moment.
Okay. Yeah. And so what would be new here, as far as that goes, that would not be new. What would be new here is that what previously could be understood to be some sort of religious, mystical understanding is now a scientific understanding. That's the claim of the thinking now occurring. That there is a logic that articulates it. And all this math and language is a form of the evidence of the scientificalness of this understanding. Okay. Speaking of which, so then I do some fancy linguistic mathematical footwork here on 399 and following. What I want to do again is to abstract from it the conceptual meat of it. I had been on page 399. I set up a proportion. It's a little complicated mathematically, but you can get the sense of it if you notice, for example, that proportion on the bottom of 399, the damned is to the resurrection of the dead, as the hymen is to the kingdom of heaven, and what I'm using there are the numbers there are the integral products or the absolute forms of those expressions in the Hebrew, okay? And the reason I'm doing that is that I have noted for example, that the first two mathematical numbers in the proportion, 3.24 times 10 to the 16th and 1.024 times 10 to the 17th, if you go up to the top of the page, you'll see them, you'll see that they appear there, and in other words, in a previous proportion, and then I associate that set with the next two, the numbers for hymen and kingdom of heaven, and they in turn have been previewed in a slightly different context on page 397. So I'm pulling together at this point in the text the mathematical, linguistic elements of certain analysis that's gone on hitherto. And then I'm proving it out mathematically. And what I get in the first instance is the mathematics that is at the root on page 400 of the Hebrew for the fulfillment of one's hopes, right? And here, no, this is nice coincidence, right? So what I've been emphasizing most recently here is what? We're beyond expectation. We are now at, if I use the language here, fulfillment. We've gone from expectancy to receptivity. We've gone from being pregnant, being expecting, right, to having the child delivered into our arms, where we have the unshiftable imperative, right? So, see, what I love about Levinas, the point of contact. Oh, I only wish I could resurrect him. He only died that many years ago, 95. It's terrific. And he was still functioning. It's amazing. Intellectually, and I don't know whether at the last minute, but right up to the last. But what is the positive truth in Levinas, right? Well, the positive truth in Levinas is, even though he can't stomach a beginning, see, he can't give birth to it. If he can't stomach it, he can't give birth to it. Okay. But what is the point? That there is an analogy between being pregnant and being the new mother. That is, the analogy is, barring extreme negative action, right? When you're pregnant, you don't have any choice in the matter. While you're pregnant, and you just got to put up with it. And once the child is born, it's a different situation, but you still don't have a choice. So what I'm saying is, the thinking now occurring, the point of contact with Levinas, the truth of it is in the language of the thinking now occurring, is the absolute imperative to exist. Do you say that there is that? Or put it in the negative, that what the thinking now occurring appreciates in Levinas is the notion in Levinas that the notion of choice, right, is jumps the gun, right? that it's going much too far too fast, right? And that in his world, in a pre-consciousness immediacy, and in the thinking now occurring, a consciousness immediacy, right, where his pre-consciousness immediacy is beginningless, in a positive sense. There's no beginning and no end, you see, whereas now we have a consciousness immediacy, which is the beginning, if I really do that technically, which is the beginning of consciousness. That is, the beginning of consciousness is the immediacy of consciousness, right? But it is a beginning. But what got me onto that again was there's a deep appreciation of the truth in Levinas of the lack of choice as being as having to do with the ultimate situation in which we find ourselves. So in a certain sense, he is another very closely penultimate modern thinker, penultimate to the ultimate state in which the child is born, in which we are under the absolute imperative to exist, to create the world, to say, with the additional note that's missing, well, I think it's missing in all of modernity, and that is this notion of beginning, which gets emphasized linguistically later on in today's assignment, right? It really works out beautifully. Maybe I should just take a look at that. We can always back up again. Since I'm on the topic and it's quite relevant. 418. Some of these things I only notice. It's there, but I just kind of notice it when I'm rereading it after 1,000 years. Now, what's going on here on, let's see where we can plug this in. Well, first of all, just in passing, also a nice, neat little thing up there in the Hebrew, the cornerstone of a philosophical method, the Hebrew for that, plugs in to the analysis I'm doing about the linguistic math. I'm going to back up because these are important things. I'll come back to that. But just back up one page, 416. This was so neat. On 416, and it's fairly clear. The very little numbers, no exponentials, real simple. And what you got there on the bottom half of page 416 are two Hebrew words. The first of which is the Hebrew for being, and the second of which is Yahweh in Hebrew. Okay, and as Chuck was indirectly, if not directly, saying last time, Hebrew piety avoids, and we had said that in the text too, I think, or alluded to it in Maimonides' case, right? Yahweh is not pronounced in a pious Jewish context because it's not to be pronounced until the rebuilding of the temple and and to be spoken by the high priest. Okay? So in the meantime, Hebrew tradition, whenever they come across but the word is there in the Bible, in the biblical text, right? So every time they come across the word, rather than pronounce it, they make a substitution. And one of the substitutions for the name of God, remember Maimonides, the nomen proprium, the proper name of God, what we might call the personal name of God, which is with God, according to Maimonides, before the creation, is the word being. And when you look at the two words, I don't think you have to read even Hebrew to see there are 4 letters, and they're the same 4 letters in a different order, right? And this is one of the joys of thinking through the text and being guided by the mathematics, taking it one step at a time. Way back when, in the logical chapter, as I call it, 3.1, I do this crazy stuff again, with a minimum order. 4, 1, 2, 3, and then I say, well, there's a logical order, and the logical order is 1, 2, 4, 3, and then I say there's a substantive equivalent of that, and so forth, which doesn't get much play because it's the substantive equivalent. So basically, as operating principles, the 2 significant orders are the minimum order and the logical order. And the only difference between them is 1, 2, 4, 3 is the logical order. 4 is out of place. It's in the next to last place. And the minimum order is take the 4 out of the third place and put it in the first place, and you have the minimum order. When I turned to the Hebrew and took the look at the word for being, right, which, by the way, as I think I point out in the text someplace, is also okay, I don't see it now. The word for being, in its now here's the if Augustine's key to trying to get some understanding for himself of the Trinity was to say that whatever these 3 persons are, and he doesn't like the word persons, I think I pointed out to you, because in Latin it suggests a kind of a mask, but Tertullian had made it acceptable in the West, so he goes with it, but with a lot of caveats. So for want of a better term, he actually says in his treatise on the Trinity, 3 somethings. That's really better than saying 3 persons, but okay. However, the point being, the key point that Augustine is making is that whatever these 3 somethings are, the best way we can understand them, these persons, is as relations. So in other words, the best way of understanding what I would call the differentiated unity, or what I would call, and Augustine I think understands this because he uses the term, the simplicity that God itself is, the simplicity which goes beyond undifferentiated unity, right, which is more simple than simple unity, if I can put it that way, and I have put it that way. The best way to get a grasp of that for Augustine is that relationship is the core of the differentiation in what otherwise would be thought to be an undifferentiated unity, right? Okay. So, and that goes back to the little hang-up I had with Jim last time, which I think he afterwards, I think he got it finally, but it was too late. It was after class. The machine was off. So it doesn't count. But he got the point that between the RST and the PQR, or whatever it was, that issue, that what was important was the set of relationships, what looked like the Roman numerals almost, that Peirce draws. That's the heart of the issue, right? So abstract that. The heart of the issue in the thinking now occurring is relationship. In today's text, I speak of an absolute relativity, right? But an absolute relativity goes back to absolute particularity. In other words, persons are related absolutely, not by being connected, do you see? Not by being incorporated in some sort of overarching totality in terms of which they are subsumed as merely parts, do you see? So an absolute relativity, right? So even Einstein was going in the right direction. But an absolute relativity, not a relativity in the sense of relativity as point of view, but a kind of absolute objectivity which is not a totalitarian threat, because absolute particularity is radically particularized. I mean, I got the idea but the wrong language. The absolute objectivity of the thinking now occurring is not a totalitarian threat, because the absolute objectivity is absolutely particularized, you see, which allows for this polyontological multiplication of personhood, you see, without reducing it to a matter of subjectivity, without reducing the multiplicity to a set of points of view, because the points of view, as we know from Leibniz, who was the guy who really had the core idea, requires what? That every part really be the identical universe from a different point of view, right? So talk about what do we mean by unity? What do we mean by totality? You see, there he gives with one hand and takes back with the other hand. Do you see? So a kind of absolute explosion of identity, which will be the language I'll use later in the text. Okay, so what's that got to do with this? So when I looked at this, long time after the logical business about 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4, 3, and 4, 1, 2, 3, I looked at this and I said, well, there's no way of putting 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers on these letters except if I compare Yahweh to its substitute. And when I look at them relative to one another, that's where I'm going, or that's where I was going. In relation to one another, being is in the logical order of the logical chapter, and Yahweh is in the minimum order. Do you see? So if I take the third letter in being there, the yud, that little thing looks like an apostrophe, right, in the upper word, and I put it in the front of the other three letters, I have the Hebrew for Yahweh. So what I get, so I call that, it's kind of playful, but it's not just playful. I think it's very serious. I actually, outrageously, it's amazing how I get past the copy editor, don't you think? On page 4, would you believe this? They just threw up their hands in despair, all right? On page 417, thank God.
I haven't opened enough to change anything.
Well, yeah. Well, the problem was they changed everything. I mean, they made a lot. There are still some mistakes in here, which I spent most of the time. They weren't changing it deliberately. The composer was having all kinds of problems. But dropping down 8 lines or so on page 417, I call this literally working off the mathematical linguistics of being and Yahweh in Hebrew, being minimized, right? And, I say it's a little bit playful, it's a little bit a stretch, but it's exactly right. In other words, with the thinking now occurring, right? You see, one thing you might substitute, depending on the context, for being is unity, or unity for being. In other words, there's a tradition in which the one is being. Of course, there are traditions in which the one is beyond being. Okay, but what I'm saying is one, right? So if unity is being, if the thinking now occurring has an essentially simple notion of unity, all right, or a notion of unity where unity is absolute simplicity, and therefore not an alternative to a kind of perfect differentiation. Analogously, you see, being now, it's not that thinking now occurring invents being, comes upon being for the first time, you see, but now understands being minimized. In other words, that being is a ratio, or is a proportion, do you see? And it ultimately moves between being alone, being in isolation as a logical order, and being minimized, being identified by, or having predicated of being Yahweh. Right? I said way back when, in a very different context, being is a person. Okay? So if being is Yahweh, if Yahweh, right, so conceptually what is going, this is a kind of nice mathematical linguistic analog to the conceptual notion, which again I was trying to articulate with some opposition from my friend Jim there at 2 meetings back, that the logical digits are not numbers. It's not that they cannot, and we touched on that with the 0.5 business, it's not that they cannot be construed in a certain context in terms of arithmetical values, but in and of themselves, pure and simple, qua logical, they are prenumeral, is an expression I finally wind up using later on in the text to make it just a jargon difference. right? But while prenumeral, essentially prenumeral, the logic is pre-numerical, pre-mathematical, nevertheless it is, and that's why it works in mathematical context, it is the foundation of the quantitative world of our ordinary mathematics. Do you see? So analogously, in the language of the Hebrew substitution of being for Yahweh, do you see? Yahweh is, qua mathematical linguistic analysis, Yahweh is the specific order, the minimum order of the new real trinary logic over against the what? I almost want to say in the religious context, the less sacred substitute being, the more worldly notion of being, which is the logical order, which is the normal order, right? In other words,
how do you assign 1, 2, 3, 4 to those letters?
I say, in relation to one another.
In what? You have to read through this stuff to get to
Well, I don't know whether, it might help to read through it, but what I'm saying is,
I mean, how do you know the order? You have Yod He Vav He is the tetragrammaton, and then the He Vav Yod
yeah,
He.
my point, you only know it in relation. The point I was trying to make a few minutes ago was, yes, you cannot label them. You have no way of knowing how to label them except in relation to one another. In other words, in being, in existence there, He Vav Yod He, all right? If I associate being with the logical order, then I know. Maybe this is maybe.
Oh, I see. If you do that, then
Yeah.
when you
Then-
reform them, then the other is
in the minimum order. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You haven't tried to because in Abulafia you have all the different permutations of that.
No,
He uses all of them for
Yeah.
different purposes.
No, yeah, I have not done that. Yeah. Well, and the reason I wouldn't be tempted to do it, I'm not saying it might be very interesting to do it, but the reason I wouldn't be tempted is that to me, the concept of being and the concept of Yahweh, precisely because they share the identical set of letters.
No,
right?
but I mean, he uses all the other permutations of those letters.
Oh, okay.
That's
Well, I'd be interested to look at that, but I haven't. Okay. All right. Now, what did I want to do with this? Okay. So I just didn't want to pass over that. Now, on the next page where I was started in on this, I just again note in passing the Hebrew for the cornerstone of a philosophical method plugs into, and I don't really want to pull it apart now. It plugs into the previous linguistic mathematical analysis in which, here, I'll go back one page just to show you the mathematical connection on page 417, quoting Isaiah 44, every valley, very famous passage, every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill shall be made low. Well, now just stop and think about it. I mean, it's a cliche, but if every valley were lifted up and every mountain were made low, I think we would have a perfectly flat terrain, okay? We would have, right? And so it's a very interesting image in the conjunction with what is conceptually, you see, the overcoming in the logic and conceptually of an ultimate difference between the second and third dimensions read, you see? So what will become here a more articulated notion of the absolutely infinitely flat structure of the universe, again, plugs into, metaphorically, linguistically, and mathematically, so the logic, in other words, what I'm getting at, and the cornerstone, right? The math there is the analog of the passage from Isaiah. But what I really want to come to here, because it touches on several things, on 418, let's see where I can start here. Yeah, starting a little below that reference to the cornerstone on 418. So if you go through those numbers after the cornerstone, and then you get a kind of big white space, and then the sentence starts existence. Got it? Mm-hmm. Dropping that? Okay. Existence, being, again, referring to the Hebrew word on the previous page, reduced for the first time to the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton is just the traditional term for the Hebrew Yahweh. reduced for the first time to the tetragrammaton as logic is reduced to the minimum, and reduced qua integral products. So now I'm taking the integral products of the two Hebrew words, and when I say reduced, I mean one divided by the other, one over the other, one the denominator, one the numerator. Also, by the way, logically, you could express that as this is the way Hoth likes to express it. What's the word for the first one? The consequent and the antecedent. All right, the antecedent and the consequent, the numerator and the denominator. My language here is that being is so. In other words, what I'm saying is that if I predicate Yahweh of being, mathematical linguistically predicate one or the other using the integral products, qua integral products and qua rational products as 1.666 over 2.4, it is 0.644. Now, I didn't get my calculator out here, but what I seem to be saying, and I assume that's what it is, if anybody's really quick, it turns out, what's really interesting here, I don't think I noted it, but the ratio between the integral products and the rational products is identical. And it is this ratio 0.644. And since I'm not tempted to explore the other things because I consider these two uses to be foundational, right? Then it says, this is itself at once the reduction qua rational products of recurrence, the Hebrew for recurrence, to the Hebrew for beginning, whose rational product is 2. In other words, if I predicate Yahweh in Hebrew.
Where did you get this word for beginning? Just from the dictionary?
Probably. Yeah. Yeah, it's not the beginning of Genesis, is that what you mean?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that's very complicated because
right.
all of those words are, who knows what they are. They all
right.
are sort of
right.
mushed up into
right.
each other.
Okay. So here's what's going on here, mathematico-linguistically. I'm predicating Yahweh of being, and I get a certain result, 0.69444. Then I predicate in the Hebrew beginning of recurrence. Do you see where I'm going? Right? So I'm saying, if I reduce, in the language of this text, if I reduce recurrence to beginning, if I say that I'll speak a little loosely here, the real identity of what appears to be recurrence. Recurrence is repetition, right? Things recur. The sun rises every morning, it sets every night. You see? And we were talking about repetition in another sense before, right? It appears to be a simple repetition, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, and all of a sudden, when I add that up, right, I see, if I keep doing it infinitely, I see that I get a highly differentiated, mathematically foundational structure, right, from a simple repetition, okay? So why is that? Because I said loosely last time, because it turns out that repetition is productive. I might have said repetition creates something, right? In other words, in fact, we all come from the repeated multiplication of cells, starting from what is so-called cell division, which I quarrel with, right? It's really cell multiplication. You don't get two cells. You don't divide a cell into two halves, right? You get a cell, and it turns into two. So it's not really cell division. It's one is... There you go. Talk about 1 is 2, right? So 1 is 2 is the beginning of a sequence that builds up our organic being, right? So here now, conceptually, the notion of, going back to my reference to Levinas as a kind of one dimension of the referential dimension here. So what's new, one of the ways in which we understand what's new in the thinking now occurring is the centrality of the notion of beginning. You see? Where beginning is understood to be beginning, foundationally, not, as I point out in the Faith and Philosophy appendix, not subsumed by becoming, because you see what I'm saying? In fact, if I were to translate this into Hegel, if Hegel were reading this passage, he would have recurring as the denominator. He would reduce, and in fact he does in the logic. He reduces beginning to recurring. Or in his language, he reduces beginning to becoming. Do you see that? Okay, so what is the predicate? Right? It makes all the difference in the world. The predicate in the thinking now occurring, when I'm talking about recurrence / becoming, the predicate of recurring or the predicate of becoming is beginning and not vice versa. Okay? So in that sense, the foundational aspect, almost literally foundational, the denominator role, the predicate role goes to beginning. And the language bears it out. Right? The language bears it out in a very, very neat way. Okay, but it doesn't stop there. So, as I've really already kind of said the thing I want to get to here, but what I want to say is that what I have going on these pages here, of which I've just picked out a couple of key examples, is I have a proportion, conceptual proportion now, but supported in the language and in the mathematics of the language, is that, and it runs like this. I don't want to get this wrong. Being is to Yahweh, right? Or being as an abstract ontological principle is to the personal God who creates the world ex nihilo, right? Being is to Yahweh as logic, or the logical order, is to the minimum, right? As I've just said, as recurring or becoming is to beginning. You see? So those are parallel, I don't want to say parallel universes, but you see what I'm saying? Those are parallel ratios. As being is to the personal creator God, so logic is to the logical order, or logic is to the real trinary logic, right? The ordinary logic, and you could read ordinary mathematics, is to the minimum order, which is unique to the thinking now occurring, which is the real trinary logic, as opposed to the essentially duadic structure of Peirce's triad, right? And they, in turn, that's the same ratio fundamentally as the ratio of recurrence to beginning, the reduction or the identification, foundational identification of recurrence or becoming as beginning. Right? Now, what all of that results in, again, mathematically in the text, right? Those ratios, at least two of which are spelled out in the Hebrew here. At the bottom of page 418, I say the identical logical mathematical structure found in the Hebrew for synthesis is to be found in leap, at once closing, where the integral, rational, and linear products are identically those of, that is, the last two, are identically those of the first one, that is, of the Hebrew for synthesis. Thus, the synthesis thought for the first time, all right, so in other words, this set of ratios, that predicating Yahweh of being, predicating the minimum of logic, predicating beginning of recurrence, that is mathematically, linguistically, that is identically in the Hebrew, that is synthesis. That is, if you want, and this is kind of a Kierkegaardian reference, that is a leap. That is the leap in the sense of the break, right? The leap for Kierkegaard is being over 70,000, and I said, what do you do then? In pedestrian terms, you sink or swim. So the thinking now occurring is beyond, it's groundless, right? It's the absolute imperative to exist, the absolute imperative to create, the absolute imperative to care for the child. Something like that. It's
Gravos?
I'm sorry?
You said it's gravos? What did you say?
Groundless, without ground. Yeah. And I also notice in the Hebrew that the same mathematics identifies this series of ratios, this series of reductions to the foundational beginning, to the foundational Yahweh, to the foundational minimum, is synthesis. It is the leap. It is closure. Right? All the one rational product. And so I say, thought for the first time at the top of 419, and the closing thought, that's what I wanted to get to. All right, so it's synthesis, it's leap, and it's closing, right? I'm taking that in the sense of closure, right? It's in the sense of, you know what people are always looking for closure? I mean, I hate the expression, but they are, okay? It's the end. It is finished notion, you see? I'm sorry?
It's understanding. It's understanding.
Yes, that would also, yeah, that's right, yeah. All right, so a completion, maybe, that sense, right? Again, as over against the notion of expectancy, of the incomplete, of the unrealized, right? And in that sense, realization. All right, so all right, so I do all, and I kind of recapitulated there in the top paragraph on 419, and I say, well, let me just take that last notion. Actually, starting around line 8, the very identity, rational product of this. So here's a little bit of the paradox, right? This closure is also not going to be associated with. This is a closing, but this is also an opening. We were talking before about opening and what's his name there, that unmentionable fellow with the mark. Yeah, okay. But here's Spencer, something I'm blocking. Brown. Spencer Brown. But what's being said in the text here is that, in fact, I actually say it pretty close somewhere, and we'll get to it next time, that the window, you think of a window. This goes back to Leibniz. Leibniz had the windowless monads, and I noticed that Heidegger, in rereading the text, Heidegger says, well, the windowless idea is not necessary because it presupposes that there's an inside and an outside. So Heidegger is already halfway to what I would call absolute exteriority, right? I mean, he's close. He's on the cusp, right? But so is Levinas. You understand? This is the problem. All right. So he's going, as it were, in the right direction. Now I get the idea. Okay. So he does a little critique of that, and I will later on in the book, working off the monadological idea of Leibniz, I will say that in pragmatism, we have an open window, okay? Now, my open window metaphor is that in pragmatism, I'm not locked into the bald, totally self-enclosed self-consciousness of modernity as I am in the Hegelian synthesis. When Peirce puts a monkey wrench in that collapse, the Hegelian unification, and insists that the three moments can never be superimposed on one another, so he creates a kind of triad. It's going in the direction of real trinary logic, but he still retains a certain dualism in it, which is the point of a few last discussions. I call that. And so another simple way of putting that is that in American thought, the other is not simply reducible to the self, as it is ultimately in Hegel. Or, put another way, the existence of the other is not simply ideal. Right, you see? Okay, so there's a respect for the otherness, even though that respect for the otherness is still in tension in pragmatism with a de-centered self-consciousness. It's really nice, okay? So what I'm saying then, in the text later on, which I'm kind of building up to here, but I thought to say this now and then we'll stop, is that in the thinking now occurring, it's certainly not that the window is closed, that the monad is windowless, as in Leibniz, but it's also not simply that there is a window through which in that sense the window is open to the other. That would be pragmatism. But what I want to say, and this goes back to the notion of the text as absolute existence, is that in the thinking now occurring, the window is identical with the appearance. Right? You see that? So that transcendence itself is the identity of the person, where the person is, as it were, the embodiment of the absolute imperative to create, the absolute imperative to exist for the first time, the absolute imperative to, or the absolute, put it in Levinasian terms, the absolute responsibility for the text. So the text is not someone else's creation. So here, in this thinking, the notion, which will become more pressing in a couple of chapters down, the notion of a kind of transparency. In other words, the difficulty of laying your hands on the thinking now occurring. Actually, in today's assignment, I wish I had gotten to it, but I mean, it's a very bold statement. I say something like where is it?
420 probably, because it's a very dense page.
I may have passed it already. I say that I say this window business is on 411, but there's another. Oh yeah, I speak, and we'll come back to this next time, that unity is to penetrate one another absolutely. Right? Now, if I think of penetrating one another absolutely, now if I think in terms of, let's say, a Mel Gibson movie or something like that, it's going to get pretty gory. Right? So we're obviously not talking about, you see, the notion of absolute penetration one of another, continuing on the assumption, do you see, that that we have to break through a barrier. Do you see? The absolute penetration is, you said it so well very early on in a totally different context, something about it's already here, or you were pointing to something like an absolute immediacy, right? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I remember what I said.
But you know what I'm talking about. Okay. And it's that kind of thing. In other words, you've missed it when you step back to try and locate it, so to speak. So the apparent intangibility of the notion of the absolute penetration of one by another as the very essence of unity in the thinking now occurring, that's the pure transparency of the absolutely concrete situation, which I always think of your idea that the self goes so far, withdraws so far from the outside, right? That you're left, in my language, with the absolute concretion of the person. But that's true of every person without, right? So in that sense, there's a kind of concrete explosion of identity, a concrete explosion of differentiation, a concreteness of every person. And in that sense, an absolute penetration is operating, not just here in a kind of quasi-theological way with Yahweh and the Holy Virgin, but that is the typical, I mean that in a technical sense, that is the typical locus conceptually of what is now true of the relationship between the Creator and the creation, and therefore logically in the relationship between all persons. Right? So, which I said much more crudely a long time ago, is we're all aliens. Right? We're all others. Okay, we have to stop. I've some promise. I've made some catch up, and we'll catch up a little more, and we'll keep going, and hopefully we'll get on track more fully next time. Please, if you have questions, use the forum. Use it also if you have questions for some of the answers that have come up about the more technical things we were discussing last time, and any unformulated questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we actually got away with this.